All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. Continuing on, we are in Chapter 2 of MuroxASP.NET with C# 2015 6th edition. And possibly, when I started this lecture, I should have maybe done this first, and that is to come in here and look at the toolbox. And you notice when you do that the toolbox is spread into different areas. There is standard, which holds our standard server-side controls. There is data, which is going to hold our database controls, which we get into in section 3 of the book. There is validation, which we'll hit on in the next chapter, which has our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different types. There's 5 validators and a validation summary. There's navigation, which we talk about in a later chapter, to set up menus, site paths, and tree views. There's login, which we'll talk about in a later chapter, to allow you to set up forms like a login form, password recovery form. There's even wizards in here to work on that, etc. Web parts, which I've never really used, so I'm not going to hit on those. AJAX extensions, these are not all of them. These are the standard AJAX extensions. AJAX is an acronym that stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Dynamic data, which again we're not going to hit on in this class. Here's our HTML or our standard. In other words, these are browser-side controls, where what's in here are server-side controls. In general, when there's nothing in there. All right? So kind of keep that in mind, that this chapter is more concentrating on the commands that you see here. All right? And they're kind of using the, I don't know what you'd call it, maybe the, I don't know, like the 40-90 rule, where they're going over the 40% of these that you're going to probably end up using 90% of the time. All right? So, checkboxes and radio buttons. Text, as you guess, for those, the text will be the text that's displayed next to, either to the left or the right, of each checkbox or each radio button. Checked is a Boolean field that'll be true if the radio box is highlighted or the checkbox is checked, and false if it is not. Group name, which is not used for checkboxes but for radio buttons if you want to put them into a group. Now they show some examples in the book as to how this stuff would look, and this is taken right from page 213. So again, here are checkboxes, here are radio buttons. Checkboxes 0, 1, 2, or 3 of these can be selected. Radio buttons are, named after the old AM radio buttons in a car, where ideally, once you've selected one will always be selected. You can set it up so that one is selected by default as well. So here's the code where you could create those 3 checkboxes. And here's the code that gets the value of the first checkbox whenever it changes. So this is always going to return true if that checkbox here is checked, and it will also always return false if it's not. And here's the similar stuff for the radio buttons. So again, the checkbox display is a single option that the user can use to check or uncheck, where radio buttons present a group of options where the user can select only one. For the checkbox, the check changed event is raised whenever the check property is changed. For a radio button, it's raised only when its check property is changed to checked. Okay? So when you want to determine whether a checkbox or a radio button is selected, you check its checked property in code. All right, I have to pause for just a moment here. All right, sorry about that. So we're up to page 214 and 215 in the book, talking about images. Again, we're cycling our way through these server-side properties, okay? So for images, the image URL is the absolute or relative URL of the image. The alternate text is what you'd put in the alt tag. The width and height, pretty much, pretty self-explanatory. The width and the height of the image. All right. So here's how you add an image control. And again, you can add, at the time when you're creating it, you can add the height and width also. Should mention this, that if you look here, hopefully what I'm about to do will work. That if I come through here, and let's just, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm not going to save it, but let's say that I was right here. And I wanted to add an image control. So I just drag it in. So notice what I get. Image equals, etc. That's not important. By default, when you drag these controls in, you should always get ASP : followed by the type of control, ID, which again must be unique, and run at equals server. Notice if I keep going here, and I type in, for example, width equals. Notice how it's in red because it's a keyword. So if I say 100 there, as an example, and then I come through here, and let me just put it on another line, and I say height. See how it's picking that up? And I can say height equals, and let's say 100. And I can come through here and I can say alt. Well, that's not alt, it's alternative text. Okay, so it'll pick all that stuff up for me. Oops. So you get the idea. All right. There are smarts built into these controls as you go in and you add them, okay, to your program. Image controls are designed to display GIFs or JPEGs or PNGs. If you don't specify the height or the width, it'll be displayed at full size or whatever size you specify in the CSS. So I could have just as easily used the CSS for the height and width. And in fact, in the book here, they recommend that you do that. Because again, what you're not doing then is you're not mixing the actual CSS in with your ASPX. All right. So there's an example of a hyperlink control. When you click in hyperlink control, again, it navigates to another web page, or if it's a jump link to another location within the same page. You can display text, or you can display an image for it if you want to. It doesn't really matter. Okay. For the file upload control, we've got allow multiple. If that's true, you can upload more than one file at a time. The other properties that are shown here, has file. If true, the user has selected a file to upload. File name is the name of the file you're going to upload. Posted file, as it says, the HTTP posted file object that represents the file that was posted. The method for the file upload class is the save as, which saves the posted file to the path. And it throws an error if the path doesn't exist. So again, you can put that into a try-catch block, which we'll discuss in a later chapter. This should look familiar to you. It's really, when you look at that, it's not all that different from doing a file open, okay, and getting something like that. It's the same type of an idea. So here is the code that you would create to create something like this. Again, I can't implore upon you too much. The author's using this as a demo. I totally understand and respect that. That said, don't call things file upload 1. All right? Again, I would have called mine button upload, but BTN upload, that's okay to use that particular type of putting the 3-letter prefix, but notice what they do here that I don't like. Don't mix these. Either use the control name followed by a name afterwards, or the 3-letter prefix followed by the name, but don't combine them. And the reason for that is there's a chance if you work at a company that's of any size that you might be the person who puts in some code, but later someone else might be the person who comes in there and takes that code and maintains it. And it's much better to have a standard, some kind of a protocol that you use where you do things in a standard way. Sorry if I'm sermonizing here, but it's just take it from somebody who's been there. Okay? So again, the file upload control displays a text box and a browse button, as we saw right here. You must provide a control to post the page. In the code behind file, you must call the save as method to save the file. And, otherwise, it's going to be gone after you bring it up. So they show you some associated code here. As I mentioned, you would typically put this into a try-catch block. You should have seen a try-catch block in the C# class. If you don't remember it, we're going to go through exception handling in a later chapter. So at that time, we'll discuss the try-catch block in more depth and breadth of coverage. All right, buttons, link buttons, and image button controls. Okay, so there's a button, there's a link button, there's an image button. They're all doing the same type of thing. They're all sharing the same types of properties that you see here. All right, so we've got text, and that's for a button or a link button only. Text doesn't really make a whole boatload of sense for an image. One of the reasons you use an image button is so that you don't have to have any text. All right. The image URL is for the image button only. That's the image that's displayed instead of text. That image button will also have alternate text. So if for some reason you put a wrong name in there or a wrong path or whatever, or the image doesn't exist, that's what will be displayed. Causes validation, which is true by default. That means that page validation should occur when the button is clicked. Command name and command argument. We looked at those a little bit in the C# class. The command name is an object that's passed to the command event when the user clicks the button. And the argument is a string value that's passed to the command event when the user clicks the button. And we're going to look at that in just a second. The postback URL is the URL of the page that's requested when the button is clicked. Now, here is the code that you would use to create the three buttons that are shown there. So this is the standard button. This is a link button. So notice button, link button, and that is an image button. All right. Most people will think, well, geez, now that I can use these, I'm going to use image buttons. It's very easy to muck up, that's muck with an M as in Mary, to muck up a form by putting too many images on it. It can make it very hard to maneuver your way around. All of these buttons are, for lack of better words, submit buttons. Okay? If on here you don't have the postback URL, if it is encoded, the page is posted back to the server when the button is clicked. And the click and the command events are raised. So you can code event handlers, in other words, put code in for either or for both of them. If you do put the postback URL property, as we have here and here, all right, so if you do post them back, the page specified is going to be loaded and executed. Now, when the click event handler is raised, two events are passed, the sender and E. The sender is the control that the user clicked in order to make that page come up, and E is information about the events. We talked about these before in the past, where E might be, for example, when you use something like if you mouse events. So if you need to know where you are on the page, maybe it's a game or something else. So when you work with buttons and you've got command name and command argument as are shown here, this is the chart that's on the top of page 221. The command name, all right, this is, it says here that the figure shows how you can use the command event to process a group of button controls within a single event handler. So if you have something like this and you want to be able to process them as a group, you should have seen this kind of thing before, where you click here, you go to the last record, first record, previous record, and next record type of thing. And there's the code that would go along with it. So the command event will automatically be raised, in this case, whenever you click a button control. You can use that instead of a click event when you want to raise one event handler for a group of buttons like this. The E argument that's passed is the command event args object. It contains the value of the command name and the command argument properties. All right? So this is setting it up, and this says, okay, this is what I want to have happen when you click any of these buttons. So notice button first, there's the first, go to the first row. Button last, go to the last row. Button next, go to the next row. Button previous, go to the previous row. All right. Let's jump on to page 222 and 223 and talk for a second about list box controls. List box controls, as it says, the common properties are rows, which specifies the number of items that are displayed in a list box at one time. And if you can't display all of them, you'll automatically get a scroll bar added. And selection mode. The default here is single, which means you can select only one option, but you can set it to multiple. For list items, the common properties are text, which is the text that's displayed for the list item, value, which is the string associated with the list item, and selected, which indicates whether or not an item is selected. Now this is kind of important right here to realize that when you look at this stuff and we talk about text and value, all right, because they're not always the same thing. The most standard way of looking at this is a lot of times what people will display for text. Now here they are the same, but a lot of times, let's say I'm having a drop down or some kind of a list for states. This might say, for example, Missouri, and that might be what shows on the screen. So that's in the text. The value, this is what you store. So if I'm storing it in a database, I may not want to store Missouri. I might want to store the abbreviation MO. So quite often what's in the text and what's in the value are the same, but they don't have to be. Remember that when you use a drop-down list, you're letting the user select one item in a list. Where the list box, it's possible that they can select multiple items if the multiple is set to true. Now also remember when you work with this, the way that you bring this up is that as soon as you add a control like this, so again, if I come back to our code and I come in here and let's just we'll add a list box. So I'm going to just take this and drag it out here. All right. So if I come back in here and I come back into design mode, there it is. And if I click here, that's a smart tag. If I click edit items, I can fill this up right away. So in other words, I can click add. And if I come in here and the text that I add is, let's say Jeffrey, let's say I say Jeff. But what I want to actually store rather than Jeff is Jeffrey Paul Scott. And I click another add, and now I put in Sandy, my wife, but instead here I put in Sandra K. Scott. All right, and then I've got Taylor, but the value here will be Taylor Francis Scott. And then I've got Mackenzie. but I want this to be Mackenzie Marie Scott. And finally, I've got Chloe, but what I want to actually store is Chloe Jude Scott. All right, so you see that when we do these, and I come over to here and I go back to design mode, I'm sorry, yeah, I guess I want to be in design mode. If I run these, all these show right now, but all that shows is the Jeff, the Sandy, etc. So I can set this up by clicking edit items. That's one way I can set all this up. Or if I don't want to bring up the smart tag, I can click on this, come over to here, and somewhere over here there's a collection property, and I can set it through there too. All right. Or I can come in and set it in code. Now, the choose data source will become important later when we bring the database into it, because typically I won't want to, if I've got 20 people in my family, I don't want to have to hard code those in. If they're in a database, I want to pull them out. All right, so we'll hit on that at a later time. And the postback, if this is checked, this says that anytime I change what's highlighted, bring that, make a call back to the server. All right. So that's pretty much how to use the collection editor that's on page 223 in the book. Okay. All right. List controls themselves on 224 and 225. List controls for, like if you're using a list box, selected item. The list item object for the selected item. Okay. If nothing has been selected, there won't be anything there. It'll be the empty string. Selected index is a zero base, so it starts with 0. So if I've selected the first item, selected index would be set to 0. If no items are selected, it would be set to -1. Okay, and selected value is the actual value that's associated with that. Anytime I change, a selected index changed event will fire. So these are the properties that let you get the selected list item object, the index, or the value. You can set this auto postback property to true if you want the page to post back as soon as the user selects an item. So this, although they don't show it, this would create a drop-down list that would have the days of the week in it. Here's the code that's associated, as mentioned there, with getting the value for different list items. This is the kind of thing that's not going to make a boatload of sense until you start to use it. Okay? All right, common properties of a list control are items. That's basically an array of items. So if you want to add something to a list box, it's the name of the list box.items.add. If you want to remove an item from a list box, it's the name of the list box.items.remove. If you want to remove all items from a list box, it's the name of the list box.items.clear, etc. Count is the number of, basically the number of objects that are in the list box. Again, they're numbered from 0. When you load items into a list box using strings, both the text and the value are set as we looked at before. To set them to different properties, you must create a list item object. Well, I showed you one way of doing that. Okay? Here are some of the common methods that I mentioned to you before. By default, when you add an item to a list box, it adds it to the end. I believe by default, when you remove an item, it removes the top item. So it's a last in, first in, first out type of thing. All right, we use this back in our future value example to fill up our drop-down list. Remember that it held 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, 200, 350, 350, 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350, 400, 450, 500. All right. And here's how you would load items into a drop-down list. Properties for radio buttons. This is on 228 and 229 in your text. We've got the repeat layout, which specifies whether ASP.NET should use a table, an unordered list, or an ordered list, or just have them flow like they would normally. Repeat direction. That's horizontal or vertical. Repeat columns are the number of columns for the controls. They show you some examples here. And then they show you the associated code. Okay. Here's a statement that checks if the first item is selected. So again, it's treated as an array, and the first item would be the 0th item. Remember that a radio button is for mutually exclusive items, so only one can be selected at a time. Whereas a checkbox, they're independent. So if I've got a checkbox like this with 3 options, that means either 0 or 1 or any 2 or all 3 can be selected. But with a radio button, if I don't have any selected by default, as soon as I choose one from then on out, one must be selected. It's just the way that they work. Here is code to set up a radio button list and to check its selected value. All right, and that was in the book on pages I believe 226 and 227. All right. Before we go on, because I'm going to stop before we get here, that's page 220, 230. But on 228 and 229, again, they talk in here about how you can set this stuff up, but they also mention on the bottom of the page that you can set up bulleted lists also. All right, so this is a good place to stop because we're up to page 230. We've got about 10 pages or so left in the chapter. And what we will do is we'll stop here and then we'll go back and we'll take a look at this, where we put a bunch of these controls into action, so to speak. So I'll be back with that shortly.